There are moments on television that stop you completely. Not slow you down, not make you glance up from your phone, completely stop you. Where the room you're sitting in disappears, where the noise around you falls away, where the only thing that exists is what's happening on that screen. Those moments are rare, they don't come often. But when they do, you remember them for a long time. Sydnie Christmas created one of those moments. She walked onto the Britain's Got Talent stage in 2024 carrying something that's difficult to name but impossible to miss. It wasn't arrogance. It wasn't the polished, rehearsed energy of someone who had been media trained within an inch of their personality. It was quieter than that, deeper than that. She looked like a woman who had been waiting for a very long time, and had finally, after everything, decided that today was the day she would stop waiting. She stood there in front of the lights and the cameras and the thousands of strangers, and she looked almost peaceful. And then she opened her mouth. What came out wasn't just a voice. It was something that felt older than the room she was standing in. Something that bypassed your ears and went somewhere else entirely. It reminded you of things you hadn't thought about in years. A kitchen that doesn't exist anymore. A person you miss. A feeling you couldn't quite name but knew you'd felt before. It was warm in the way that very few things in this world are genuinely warm. The judges leaned forward without realizing they were doing it. The audience went still. Simon Cowell, a man who has spent decades listening to the best voices in the world, sat back in his chair with an expression that looked a lot like wonder. She won the golden buzzer. She went on to win the entire competition. And for a brief, beautiful moment, the whole country seemed to exhale at the same time. Then the celebrations slowed. The headlines moved on. And Sydnie Christmas, the woman who had made Britain feel something unexpectedly real, began to drift, just slightly, just quietly, out of the spotlight she had only just stepped into. And people started to notice. They started asking questions, soft questions at first, then more persistent ones. Where was she? What was actually happening behind the scenes? Why did her story feel like a book someone had left open in the middle and never came back to finish? This is the part of the story the cameras didn't show you. To understand where Sydnie went, you first have to understand where she came from. Because the woman who stood on that stage in 2024 didn't appear out of nowhere. She was built slowly, carefully, over many years. In rooms that had nothing to do with television, and everything to do with loving something enough to keep choosing it, even when it didn't choose you back. She grew up in Essex, in a life that wasn't shaped around the idea of fame. There was no show business family, no early manager, no carefully plotted path towards stardom. There was just a girl who loved to sing, not because someone told her she was extraordinary, not because she was chasing something, but because music was the clearest way she knew how to exist in the world. From the time she was young, people around her noticed her voice. Friends noticed it, family noticed it, teachers noticed it. But notice is a gentle word, it doesn't always lead anywhere. And for a long time for Sydnie it didn't. She trained anyway, she worked anyway. She took musical theater seriously, studied it with real dedication, and performed in the kinds of venues that don't get written about. Small stages, modest audiences. The kind of work that builds a person without building a profile. For years, she lived inside a space that artists know deeply and rarely talk about, the space between being genuinely talented and being genuinely seen. It is a lonely place to live. It requires a particular kind of faith that has nothing to do with religion and everything to do with stubbornness and love. There's a quiet grief that comes with knowing what you're capable of and not yet being given the room to show it. You don't talk about it at dinner, you don't post about it. You just carry it day after day, choosing the thing you love over the easier paths that keep appearing beside it. Sydnie carried it. She was in her 30s when she auditioned for Britain's Got Talent. In a world that tells women that their window closes early, that youth is a prerequisite for being taken seriously, she stood in that queue anyway. She wasn't reckless about it. She wasn't naive. She was simply someone who had lived with her dream long enough to understand its full weight, had questioned it thoroughly, and had chosen it one more time. That choice, quiet, deliberate, and made in full awareness of the risk, is where the real story begins. Britain's Got Talent has always been built on a particular kind of magic trick. It sets up an expectation and then it pulls the rug out. Audiences arrive knowing the format, knowing the arc, believing they can predict what comes next. And most of the time they can. But every now and then someone steps out of that formula entirely. They don't fit the pattern. They don't play the game the way the game expects to be played. And when that happens, something genuinely surprising occurs. Sydnie Christmas broke the formula quietly. She didn't arrive carrying a dramatic backstory designed for maximum emotional impact. She didn't perform the vulnerability that reality television often rewards. She was simply herself, composed, warm, carrying the mild nerves of someone honest enough not to hide them. She talked about singing the way people talk about breathing, not as ambition, as necessity, and then she sang. She chose You'll Never Walk Alone, a song so deeply embedded in the British consciousness that it practically lives in the walls of the country. A song that has been performed so many times by so many people that making it feel new seems almost impossible. For the first few seconds, it was genuinely difficult to know whether she had made the right choice. The opening notes landed in a room full of people who already knew every word, every swell, every place the emotion was supposed to arrive. And then her voice found its full height. It wasn't impressive in a technical, clinical way, it was true. There is a profound difference between a voice that demonstrates skill and a voice that tells the truth, and Sydney's voice was the second kind. It had texture. It had lived experience in it. It carried the unmistakable weight of someone who had actually walked through hard things and come out the other side still believing in the words they were singing. That cannot be manufactured. It cannot be trained into existence. Either it's there or it isn't. The audience rose. Amanda Holden reached for the golden buzzer before the final note had even settled in the air. The confetti fell and Sydney stood in the middle of it, crying. With the expression of someone who had waited a very long time for the world to see them, and was still struggling to believe that it finally had. She wasn't just a contestant in that moment, she was something that people needed, a reminder, proof visible and undeniable that keeping going quietly and without guarantee can lead somewhere real. The competition continued and Sydney continued with it. She returned to the stage week after week and delivered something consistent, something grounded. She wasn't trying to reinvent herself. She wasn't chasing the bigger production or the showier moment. She came back each time as the same person she had been the first time, fully present, deeply committed, emotionally honest. It turns out that is harder to sustain than it sounds, and she sustained it beautifully. When the votes were finally counted, Sydney Christmas had won Britain's Got Talent 2024. The world responded the way the world tends to respond to something that feels genuine. It shared her story. It replayed her audition. People who had never watched a single episode of the show found themselves crying in front of a small phone screen at 11 o'clock at night, not entirely sure why. She was called a breath of fresh air. She was called a reminder that talent has no age limit, that persistence is its own kind of answer. All of it was true. None of it was exaggeration. But here is what the celebration didn't show. Winning Britain's Got Talent is not the end of anything. It is the beginning of something far more complicated and far less cinematic. The cameras capture the confetti, they don't capture the weeks that follow, the contracts, the conversations, the gap between what a win promises and what an industry is actually prepared to deliver. Sydney had walked through a door that millions of people would have given almost anything to walk through. But the room on the other side of that door, it turned out, had its own set of rules. The music industry does not operate on sentiment. It operates on categories, on commercial viability, on decisions made in offices by people who are thinking about markets rather than moments. A Britain's Got Talent win is a significant credential, but it is not a blank check. It opens certain doors while quietly leaving others firmly closed. And for an artist like Sydney, a woman in her 30s rooted in classical emotional performance, resistant by nature to packaging, navigating that landscape would require more than talent. It would require patience and a willingness to hold her ground. In the months after her win, the questions began arriving in the quieter corners of the internet. Fan communities, the kind that form around artists because people genuinely care, started to notice something. The major label machinery that usually follows a BGT win, the press tour, the constant media presence, the high-profile promotional appearances, wasn't moving at the speed people expected. Sydney was working, she was performing, she was recording, but the visibility felt thinner than her talent deserved. Some of the discussion pointed toward the complexity of talent show contracts, which are rarely structured primarily in the artist's favor. Some questioned whether the industry simply didn't know how to place her, whether a woman who sang the way she sang, with that particular combination of classical warmth and deep emotional sincerity, fit cleanly enough into any existing commercial template. These were not angry conversations, they were concerned ones. They came from people who had invested something real in her story and wanted to understand why the momentum felt like it was moving through water. And Sydney, through all of it, remained quiet in a dignified way. She spoke about her experiences with warmth and without bitterness. She acknowledged difficulty without weaponizing it. She gave the impression of someone who had made a private decision about how she wanted to carry herself through this industry and was simply getting on with it. That restraint was admirable. It was also, in its own way, a kind of shield. It meant that the full picture stayed partially hidden and the questions kept quietly accumulating. What those questions often missed was the music itself. Because Sydney had not stopped making it, she was releasing work, she was building toward an album. She was performing for audiences who came specifically because they wanted to be in the same room as her voice. Her debut single found its listeners, and those listeners responded with the kind of warmth that doesn't come from hype. It comes from recognition. From the feeling of hearing something real in a landscape that is increasingly saturated with things that are only performing realness. Reviews noted her refusal to chase what was current. Her willingness to simply be what she was, unhurried, uncompromised, emotionally present in every note. In a world that rewards novelty and constant reinvention, that kind of steadiness can look like stillness from the outside. But from the inside, it is an active and difficult choice made again and again, every day. The deeper question, the one that ran underneath so many of the conversations happening online, was about whether the environment around her was truly built to support what she was doing. Whether the people making decisions about her career understood the specific and irreplaceable nature of her gift, whether they were thinking in years or in quarters. These were questions that said something larger about the way the industry treats artists who don't fit its preferred molds, and something specific about what Sydney was navigating. Here is the thing that is easy to forget and worth remembering. Sydney Christmas existed before Britain's Got Talent. She had a craft, a philosophy, a fully developed artistic identity that was shaped over decades before a single camera was ever pointed at her. The show gave her a platform, it gave her an audience. But it did not give her who she was, that was already there, it had always been there. And that matters enormously because it means that everything the audience fell in love with was real. When she cried on that stage, those were not performed tears. When she spoke about what music meant to her, those were not scripted words. There was no distance between who she was and what she was showing. That kind of authenticity is vanishingly rare in a world built partly on performance, and it is also, paradoxically, one of the hardest things for an industry built on packaging to know what to do with. She has spoken in various interviews about her approach, patient, deliberate, focused on what she wants her career to look like not next month but in a decade. She is not competing with artists half her age for short-form attention. She is not trying to be something the algorithm finds easier to promote. She is doing something older than any of that, building a body of work, slowly and carefully, that will still mean something long after the conversation has moved on. Whether the people around her fully share that vision, and whether they are giving her the support she needs to realize it, remains genuinely unclear. What is clear is that she has not disappeared. She simply refused to dissolve herself into something more convenient. There is a story about Sydney Christmas that fits neatly on a card. Girl with a dream, years of trying, one perfect moment. Everything changes. It is a satisfying story, it has a clean shape. Television was built for that shape, but the real story is rougher around the edges, more interesting, more honest. What her journey actually reveals, when you look at it without the confetti and without the competition format, is something that a lot of people recognize even if they can't immediately name it. The experience of being genuinely good at something and watching the world take a long time to fully meet you where you are. The experience of having a moment of real, undeniable recognition and then discovering that recognition and support are not the same thing. The gap between being seen and being truly held. She is a patient person, not passively patient, the kind of patience that is actually a form of quiet courage. The kind that says, I know what I'm doing and I know why I'm doing it, and I am willing to wait for the world to understand that, even if the waiting is hard. You can hear it in the way she talks. You can see it in the choices she makes. She is not performing groundedness, she actually has it. That is a rare and serious thing. The people who voted for her, who cried alongside her, who sent her audition to people they loved, they were not wrong about what they saw. They saw something real. And real things don't evaporate just because the cameras stop rolling. They continue, in smaller rooms, in careful, considered recordings. In the steady, unglamorous work of someone who has always understood, at a cellular level, that building something that lasts is a long and quiet process. Where did Sydney Christmas really go after Britain's Got Talent? She went back to work. She went back to the place she has always lived, inside the music, inside the craft, inside the daily decision to keep going because it matters and because she is made for it. She went back to being exactly who she was before the world discovered her, which was, when you think about it, the most powerful thing she could possibly have done. The world found her once. And if it is paying any attention at all, it will find her again. If something in this story sat with you, you're not alone in that. There is something about watching a person hold on to who they are, even when the world is offering them easier, louder, more convenient versions of themselves, that reaches something deep. If you want to stay with stories like this one, stories told slowly and honestly about people who deserve to be understood rather than just celebrated, then subscribe and come back. And leave a thought in the comments if you have one. What do you think Sydney's story is really saying? We'd love to know.